The data stream is
A Navy
accelerating.
SEAL asked
Significant
her
energy
rank as a
spikes
joke,
across the
then
board.
4 generals
Reroute
snapped
auxiliary
into
power to
salute
the
at
containment
once.
field.
The
I'm
Strategic
initiating
Command
lockdown
Center
procedures.
pulsed with a low,
Sergeant, the
mechanical
trajectory
heartbeat,
just
the
shifted.
constant
They're
hum of
accelerating.
servers,
I
the
see it.
tight staccato
All
of
teams,
keyboards,
prepare for
the
immediate
soft
evasive
beeps from
maneuvers.
dozens of tactical screens
Sir,
tracking
the
drone
coordinates just
feeds,
updated. They're targeting
maritime
the mainframe
grids,
in Sector
and
Gamma.
satellite
All
overlays.
teams, redirect to Gamma
Red and blue
immediately.
lights
Secure that
washed
perimeter
across
now.
the walls,
have
casting
to
long
initiate the
bars of
sequence
color
now,
over the
and we are
rows
out
of
of
Navy
time.
personnel seated at their
Confirmed, Commander.
consoles.
Engaging
It was the kind
lockdown
of room
protocol
only
immediately.
senior officers ever entered.
They've breached the outer
The kind of
wall.
room where
Weapons
clearances
hot.
weren't just
Alpha and
high,
Beta teams.
they were
Secure
sacred.
the perimeter
And in the
now.
middle of
Let's
that room
move.
stood her. A young woman in a plain gray
Move!
t-shirt.
Get clear of the
No
collapse
rank
zone.
tabs, no unit patches, no insignia, nothing that should give her permission to even breathe the air in this place. She stood still, hands at her sides, as if the entire weight of the command floor meant nothing. When the rear doors hissed open, Petty Officer Caleb Rockle strode in, shoulders squared, a man who had deployed 7 times and carried every ounce of confidence that came with it. He spotted her instantly. His steps slowed. His eyebrows rose. Then the smirk appeared. "Well now," he said, loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. "Did someone lose their intern?" A few operators chuckled. One soldier near the left wall, the one who'd been watching everything with idle amusement, tilted his head as if to better enjoy the show. Rockle didn't stop until he stood right in front of her, blocking her from the view of half the room, intentionally making the moment as public as possible. "All right," he announced, projecting his voice so the entire operations floor could hear. "Since you're standing in the middle of my command center, why don't you tell us your rank?" More snickering rose from behind the consoles. Does she even have a uniform? Probably a tech support mistake, wrong room. Someone check if she's delivering coffee. The woman didn't flinch. No anger. No shame. No confusion. Just stillness. Deliberate, controlled, unnervingly calm. Rockle waited for the hesitation, the apology, the stammering justification he was certain would come. He even leaned forward slightly, as if trying to catch the beginnings of her excuse. But she didn't hesitate. "Your rank," he repeated, mocking now. "Or do you need help spelling it?" She blinked once, then answered. 2 words. Soft, even, and sharp enough to slice through the entire room. For a full second, no one reacted. Then the reactions crashed in like a tide. Rockle's face drained of color. A tech specialist halfway across the room dropped his stylus. The soldier against the left wall stopped smirking entirely, posture snapping straight with a sudden jolt of disbelief. A few operators turned in their seats so fast their chairs squeaked against the floor. Fingers hovered frozen above keyboards mid-stroke. The screens continued updating tactical data, but no one looked at them now, not when something impossible had just been spoken. The woman didn't move. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't justify. It was the rest of the world that shifted. A proximity alert chimed from the central screen. The room collectively inhaled. One of the main displays shifted from standard layout to a black interface rimmed in red, a color almost no one in the room had ever seen used. It cycled rapidly through encrypted identifiers, cross-referencing something deeper than any SEAL, any officer, had access to. Then it stopped, and a line of text appeared across the screen. Access level verified Omega designation. Authorized presence confirmed. A silence, heavier than steel, slammed into the room. Rockle took a half step back, as if distance might help his brain make sense of what he was seeing. His mouth opened once, closed, then opened again. No sound came out. That can't be real," someone whispered. Omega was a clearance level that didn't officially exist anymore. A classification buried years ago. Locked. Erased. Forgotten. Yet the system that never made mistakes, had just kneeled to her. She still didn't move. Didn't smirk. Didn't acknowledge their shock. Her calm wasn't arrogance, it was familiarity. As if this moment, this reaction, this unraveling of the room had happened before. Operators who had been laughing minutes earlier now stood without realizing they'd done so. A few instinctively straightened their posture. Others stepped out of her way despite her not moving an inch. The quiet soldier at the back swallowed hard. "That's a general's clearance," he whispered. "Higher even. Higher than all of us." Rockle finally found his voice. Barely. "Who? Who exactly are you?" But she didn't answer. The doors behind them began to unlock heavy, reinforced, multi-layered. Every head turned. because only one category of personnel triggered those doors, and no one in the room was ready for what stepped through next. The blast doors opened with a heavy hydraulic shutter that rolled across the command center, causing dozens of operators to rise instinctively as 4 senior flag officers stepped inside, with the controlled precision of men accustomed to shaping national policy rather than observing it. Their presence alone shifted the air, replacing the usual hum of tactical urgency, with a deeper, more solemn weight that pressed into the lungs of everyone present. No one expected commanders of this rank to appear unannounced, and certainly not during an active operations cycle where every second was logged and monitored. General Aldrich Hayes, carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had witnessed too many buried truths, scanned the floor with deliberate patience before his eyes settled on the woman standing motionless beneath the overlapping bars of red and blue light. Something in his expression tightened, not with anger, but recognition, a subtle flicker that suggested he was looking at a ghost he had once sworn would never return to the surface. Beside him, General Novak paused mid-step, his attention narrowing as he studied her with the analytical focus he normally reserved for compromised assets or classified anomalies. The operators exchanged uneasy glances as the officers moved closer, because the generals didn't spare a glance for the tactical screens or the mission boards. Their attention was fixed solely on her, as if she were the only gravitational center in the room. The quiet soldier in the corner straightened abruptly, jaw tightening with an instinct he didn't fully understand, while Petty Officer Rackles stepped aside in an attempt to mask the fear creeping into his face. Several technicians scrambled to verify the Omega-level confirmation flashing across the system, but every terminal rejected their access attempts before redirecting them to a locked notice that offered no explanation. That alone deepened the tension, because the system didn't block SEAL Tech Ops unless someone far above their clearance had taken command of the room. A hush settled over the operators as General Hayes approached her, the silence deep enough that even the hum of the servers seemed to retreat. "You were never supposed to step into an active command environment again," Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying across the floor with a slow, controlled resonance that made several operators stiffen. The woman met his gaze without a hint of hesitation, her posture steady in a way that suggested detachment born not of arrogance, but of long familiarity with fear and authority sharing the same space. General Novak adjusted his stance, examining her with the intensity of someone evaluating a threat capable of overturning decades of classified history. "What triggered your reactivation, and why did this facility authenticate a designation that was formally retired?" he asked, his tone restrained but edged with disbelief. Around the room, operators stood frozen, aware they were witnessing something no training scenario had prepared them for. Before she answered, a sharp alert pierced the floor, cutting through the air like a blade. The main tactical projection expanded into a full-grid display, highlighting an unidentified signal rising from outside standard surveillance corridors, pulsing with a coded pattern that sent several senior technicians backward in their chairs. The frequency repeated with mechanical certainty, broadcasting a signature associated with intelligence files sealed so deeply that not even the flag officers could access them without congressional oversight. The woman's eyes lifted toward the projection, her expression tightening with a subtle recognition that made Hayes inhale sharply. "It's the same pattern," he murmured, stepping closer as dread rippled across the officers behind him. The woman gave a small, controlled nod, and the motion alone caused several SEAL operators to exchange worried glances, realizing the threat wasn't new, it was returning. Rockel tried to reclaim authority, his voice cracking under the weight of the unfolding moment. "Sir, there must be some mistake. She can't possibly—" But the words evaporated when Novak turned a single cold look in his direction, silencing him more effectively than any disciplinary order. The quiet soldier near the consoles watched her carefully, studying the precision in her breath and the measured stillness in her stance, recognizing patterns only seen in operatives who survived missions never spoken aloud. General Hayes finally addressed the room with an authority that left no room for debate. "All current operations are suspended. Secure your consoles and transition to Red Continuity Protocol immediately." His order carried across the floor, triggering a wave of movement as operators locked their sessions, encrypted data trails, and redirected automated feeds to standby channels. As the command center adjusted to the abrupt shift, the generals closed in around her, lowering their voices with a mixture of urgency and reluctant respect. Operators watched from a distance, unable to hear the words but sensing the gravity of every exchanged glance. The woman listened without interrupting, her expression remaining composed despite the rising storm of tension swirling around her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and precise, carrying through the room with chilling clarity. "If that signal is active again, you don't have hours," she said, her tone devoid of fear or uncertainty. "You have minutes." Her warning landed like a physical blow, and several technicians instinctively turned back to their screens, hoping for any data that might contradict her. None appeared. The generals exchanged a brief, grim look, accepting the truth none of them wished to confront. In that moment, everyone in the operations center understood the hierarchy had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The woman no one recognized now held the room in the palm of her hand, not through rank or intimidation, but through a truth the system itself had confirmed. Whatever she had been before operative, myth, or classified ghost, she had become the single most critical figure in the building. And the threat returning from the dark wasn't coming for the country first. It was coming for her. A heavy quietness rolled across the command center as operators hovered anxiously near their stations, unsure whether to resume their duties or wait for orders that no one was prepared to give. The woman stepped toward the tactical projection with a measured calm that contrasted sharply with the rising tension gripping the rest of the room, and even the senior officers instinctively shifted aside to clear her path. She studied the hostile signal pulsing across the screen, her expression sharpening with the quiet focus of someone reading an old language others had long forgotten. General Hayes watched her closely, noticing the subtle stillness entering her posture, the kind that suggested she wasn't analyzing raw data but recalling patterns, etched into memory through years of classified exposure. The primary display continued cycling through escalating frequencies, each pulse carrying a deliberate rhythm that unsettled the operators who couldn't identify its origin. Hayes exchanged a tight glance with General Novak, both sensing she already understood more than the systems feeding them information. She reached toward a locked terminal, prompting the nearest operator to step back with a hesitant nod, uncertain whether he was relinquishing protocol or obeying something older than protocol itself. Her fingertips hovered briefly over the biometric pad, and the console activated instantly with a confirmation tone that bypassed every security challenge normally required for high-clearance access. The sudden recognition sent a ripple of disbelief through the staff, who had never seen the system unlock so quickly for anyone. General Novak stepped closer, his skepticism tinged with a defensive edge as he attempted to reassert control. Those command pathways were archived years ago, and no active personnel retain authorization to access them, he said, though the tension in his voice betrayed an uncertainty he couldn't disguise. She didn't look up, answering with a calm that carried the weight of a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. "They were archived because the people who used them could be compromised," she said quietly. "I wasn't one of them." The terminal continued unfolding restricted structures, revealing deeply buried frameworks that appeared almost surgical in their precision, causing several operators to exchange anxious whispers as the pathways illuminated like scars rising beneath cold light. The quiet soldier in the corner watched her movements with growing recognition, noticing the deliberate cadence of her breathing and the subtle efficiency in her posture, identifying traits no civilian or conventional officer would possess. The tactical projection expanded again, absorbing new data from aerial, maritime, and orbital channels, revealing the hostile signature, intensifying in strength as though reacting directly to her presence. General Hayes stepped forward, his voice carrying a controlled weight that drew every eye toward him. "If that signal escalates every time you engage the system, then this is coordinated behavior," he said, his tone tightening as the implications settled heavily across the room. She nodded once, entering a command sequence that caused the command center's secondary displays to shift into a mode most operators had only seen during joint agency war games. "They're not resurfacing at random," she said, her eyes remaining locked on the emerging patterns. "They're probing your response time to see whether this facility still understands the rules they designed." The words struck the operators with cold clarity, forcing several to recheck the data streams with trembling hands. General Novak bristled, unwilling to accept the implication that his command might be predictable in a conflict built on deception and misdirection. "You assume we lack the capacity to mount an effective counter," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the rising panic. She finally raised her eyes to his, her gaze steady and unblinking, carrying neither defiance nor apology, only truth. I assume nothing, she replied, her voice quiet but immovable. I'm telling you they know your doctrine because they helped shape it. A stunned silence spread through the room as operators processed the idea that an adversarial entity might understand their internal tactical responses better than they did. The projection emitted a sudden lateral spike in the hostile frequency, causing several technicians to flinch as the image brightened with alarming speed. She leaned closer, studying the spike with a familiarity that suggested intimate experience rather than theoretical training. "Do not redeploy your drones," she said sharply, stopping 3 operators who had already initiated the launch protocols. "That spike is a feint meant to pull your surveillance grid off the corridor they need." The operators froze, watching the data realign exactly as she predicted, confirming her analysis with chilling accuracy. General Hayes stepped toward her with a controlled breath, acknowledging her inference with a simple nod that carried more authority than any formal order. "Then what corridor are they aiming for?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. She pointed toward a dim sector on the projection, a region normally filtered as background noise, her voice dropping to a tone colder than the room's hum. "There," she said, "that's where they expect you not to look." Operators zoomed into the sector, revealing faint patterns that had gone unnoticed due to their minimal movement signatures, yet when magnified, displayed coordination far too deliberate to be random. Hayes's expression hardened as he recognized the depth of planning required to operate within such a narrow blind zone. "You saw it before the system did," he said quietly, the realization carrying a hint of awe. "I saw it because the people you're facing taught me to," she replied, her voice soft yet devastating, sending a cold shiver through the room. The silence that followed seemed to constrict the air itself, leaving every operator painfully aware that the threat they faced wasn't merely resurfacing, it was reclaiming familiar ground. In that moment, the command center understood a truth none of them wanted to confront. This enemy wasn't evolving. It was returning. And the only person who knew how to stop it was the same woman they had underestimated minutes earlier. A controlled tension spread through the command center as operators shifted their weight quietly, aware they were standing inside a crisis that exceeded their clearance, but unwilling to draw attention to themselves by moving without explicit orders. The woman remained near the console, her posture steady and contained, her eyes fixed on the dim sector she had identified earlier, while the flag officers exchanged low, clipped murmurs that carried the unmistakable cadence of restrained conflict under strict protocol. General Hayes observed her with guarded intent, recognizing the precision in her silence and the warning embedded in her stillness, while General Novak maintained a rigid stance that revealed the tightening pressure beneath his controlled exterior. Novak stepped toward Hayes with a tone sharpened by years of command discipline, his voice low enough to avoid broadcasting dissent, yet firm enough to signal disagreement. "We cannot restructure our operational posture around an unauthenticated asset," he said, measuring every word with calculated restraint. Hayes answered without raising his voice, but the weight behind his reply cut through the tension like a shift in wind before a storm. "The system authenticated her," he said quietly. "That is more than it has done for anyone in this room." Several operators exchanged subtle glances, their eyes flicking between the officers and the woman, unsure how to reconcile the chain of command with the reality unfolding before them. Novak tightened his jaw, refusing to yield even an inch. "A system can be spoofed," he said, though the faint tremor beneath his certainty betrayed the growing conflict inside him. "Our responsibility is to maintain operational integrity, not surrender it to anomalies we cannot fully articulate." Hayes didn't respond immediately, allowing the silence to stretch long enough for the operators to feel the sharp edge of his disappointment. The woman finally turned her head slightly, not fully facing them, but acknowledging the rising tension with a calm that unsettled the nearest technicians. "If you attempt to restrict my access," she said with a controlled steadiness that implied neither threat nor plea, "you will lose the only tactical advantage you still possess." Novak inhaled sharply through his nose, maintaining professionalism even as frustration pressed hard against the discipline in his expression. "Then help us understand what we are dealing with," he said, keeping his tone even but clipped. "We cannot respond to shadows." Her gaze returned to the projection, her voice dropping into a level, uninflected cadence that carried the clarity of a classified debrief rather than a personal explanation. "You are not dealing with shadows," she said calmly. You are dealing with a structure that was designed to exploit every gap in conventional doctrine. Operators stiffened subtly at her phrasing, recognizing echoes of programs they had only heard referenced in closed-door briefings or buried sections of old training manuals. Hayes's stare deepened as he stepped closer, lowering his voice with careful precision. "This isn't speculation," he said, narrowing his eyes. "You know exactly what that formation means." She nodded once, slow and absolute, her tone dropping colder than the hum of the servers surrounding them. "It belonged to a program that was dissolved and burned off record," she said, forcing several technicians to freeze mid-action as the implications settled across the room. Novak's voice tightened, though he remained composed. "Under whose authority was it dissolved?" he asked, keeping his posture rigidly centered as if bracing for an impact he couldn't define. Hayes answered before she could speak, and his voice carried the quiet finality of someone who had lived through the classified fallout. "Not ours," he said, "and not officially." "Ham." The projection flickered as she placed her palm on the console again, prompting the biometric scan to recognize her instantly and reveal a secondary grid layered beneath the primary feed. The pattern that emerged was unmistakably deliberate, its geometric precision reflecting a level of coordination that bypassed every automated filter designed to detect anomalies. She traced one of the movement trails with a steady finger, and the room watched with grim attention as the pattern clarified into a shape that suggested tactical encirclement. "They are shaping a breach corridor," she said quietly. "If they complete this alignment, your response capability will collapse before it initiates." Operators moved with careful urgency, as Hayes issued instructions in a calm, unwavering tone. "Open auxiliary channels and prepare rapid cycle mapping," he said, prompting technicians to secure their consoles and activate additional feeds. Novak followed with a measured directive, unwilling to appear stagnant in front of the staff. "Bring ground-linked sensors online and synchronize them with maritime overlays," he ordered, keeping his voice even though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. The woman studied the shifting data with a focus so sharp it unsettled several operators who had never seen someone engage the system with such controlled familiarity. "Your preparation window is collapsing faster than your sensors can adjust," she said, observing the hostile signal intensify again with unnerving precision. "They are testing your coordination for weaknesses you cannot afford to expose." Hayes absorbed the warning with a grim breath, turning toward her with a solemn clarity that acknowledged the stakes rising around them. "Then point us to the first weakness," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency tightening behind it. "Where does the threat break through?" She didn't answer immediately. The silence that followed pressed into the room with a weight that caused several operators to hold their breath without realizing they had stopped breathing. Only when the projection realigned into a familiar pattern one she recognized with absolute certainty did she finally speak. Her voice lowered to a controlled whisper that carried through the room with the force of a gunshot fired in a closed space. "The breach doesn't target your command," she said, turning slowly toward Hayes with an expression carved from cold inevitability. Her eyes stayed locked on his as she delivered the truth the entire room had been moving toward without understanding. "They're not coming for your facility." A single silent beat passed, sharp, heavy, surgical. "They're coming for me." A sharp stillness settled over the command center as her final words cut through the room like a compressed shockwave, forcing every operator to recalibrate their understanding of the threat that had been tightening around them with unsettling precision. The hostile signature pulsed again, drawing its waveform inward, as if narrowing its focus on a single confirmed target, and the weight of that intention pressed against the reinforced silence gathering around her. General Hayes held her gaze with a steady concentration that carried the gravity of something long feared, but finally recognized, while General Novak's posture stiffened into a controlled rigidity that signaled professional alarm rather than disbelief. Before anyone could recover, the facility's internal alarms activated with a deep, resonant vibration that rolled along the floor plates and illuminated the perimeter panels with a pulsing red glow. Reinforced shutters descended over every external aperture with a heavy mechanical snap, initiating the first phase of the containment protocol reserved for threats classified above conventional clearance. Operators straightened instinctively as secondary lighting engaged overhead, washing the room in an austere glow that signaled immediate elevation to internal lockdown. General Novak stepped toward the security console with clipped efficiency, his voice low and precise as he issued the first directive. "Seal lateral corridors and restrict non-essential movement," he said, maintaining a tone that remained professional despite the pressure constricting around him. Hayes followed with a parallel order designed to keep the facility internally isolated without compromising critical operations. Reroute all encrypted channels to hardened relay, he said, ensuring the command center remained insulated from any external interference. The woman observed the lockdown with a composed steadiness, her eyes fixed on the tactical projection as the signal contracted again, this time with a deliberate rhythm that suggested adaptive intelligence rather than passive tracking. A faint shift in the waveform indicated confirmation behavior, prompting several operators to glance uneasily toward the consoles as realization crept into their expressions. Hayes recognized the change before anyone spoke and stepped closer, with a voice contained by both urgency and respect. "That spike tightened when the shutters closed," he said quietly, his gaze returning to her. "They know your position." She responded with a calm that cut through the rising tension, her voice steady and controlled. "They're not analyzing your lockdown," she said. "They're confirming I'm inside it." The words settled heavily across the room, causing several operators to pause mid-action as they processed the tactical implications of a hostile force adapting its approach based on her containment. Novak's jaw tightened, but his tone remained disciplined and cool when he spoke again. "If they're adjusting for a fixed target," he said with measured precision, "we need a defensive posture calibrated to the exact vector of approach." She met his eyes without hesitation, acknowledging both the logic and the necessity behind his request. "Then you need to let me handle the interface," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that came not from rank but from history. "Your systems weren't built for the kind of breach they're preparing to deploy." Hayes exchanged a look with Novak, the silence between them heavy with unspoken calculus as another pulse from the hostile signal rippled across the projection with unnerving synchrony. The spike fractured into a pattern neither of them recognized, prompting the system to issue a priority alert normally reserved for classification tier emergencies. Operators stiffened as the warning coded itself across the display, and Hayes released a slow breath before turning back to her with firm resolve. "You have operational control on primary interface," he said. "This floor follows your lead." Novak didn't argue. He simply gave a curt nod, acknowledging necessity over doctrine in the face of a threat that didn't obey conventional logic. She stepped toward the console with a calm precision that caused several operators to instinctively shift aside, creating a clear path without needing to be told. The system recognized her instantly, activating a deeper tier of command architecture that unfolded across the projection in layered sequences none of the staff had ever seen deployed outside theoretical training modules. She placed her hands on the interface, initiating a diagnostic sweep that redirected the facility's most sensitive arrays toward the incoming signal. "They're scanning for structural seams," she said, her voice steady as the projection recalibrated into a more detailed grid. "If they find the right pressure point, your external sensors won't detect the breach until it's already in motion." Novak examined the data with professional intensity, his tone clipped but calm when he asked the next question. "How long until they commit to the vector?" She didn't hesitate as she studied the waveform. "Minutes," she said. "Less if they detect indecision." "And 40. As if responding to her words, the facility transitioned into the next stage of lockdown, sending a tremor through the floor as reinforced internal shutters locked into position around the command center. Operators steadied themselves and returned to their stations with increased urgency, their movements tightly controlled as Hayes addressed the room with unshakable clarity. "Prepare contingency protocols and stand by for her directive," he announced, signaling a temporary chain of command adjustment that rippled through the staff without open resistance. She leaned closer to the projection as the hostile frequency compressed again, the shape refining into a pattern she recognized instantly, a formation designed not for destruction, but for extraction. Her eyes narrowed as she traced the vector across the grid, her breath tightening with the recognition of a tactic used only by programs that had been erased from operational records decades ago. She didn't turn when she spoke again, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who understood exactly what was coming. "They're not testing your defenses anymore," she said, her fingers resting lightly against the console as the waveform narrowed to a precise entry arc. "They've confirmed the target and aligned the breach to match my containment." She finally looked up, and the room seemed to constrict around the quiet inevitability in her expression. "This isn't a strike against your facility," she said, her voice low but absolute. "It's an extraction attempt." Her gaze sharpened. And I'm the objective. Am sick. A deep vibration rolled across the command center as the hostile waveform snapped into a narrow assault vector, forcing several operators to brace themselves against their consoles while monitors flickered under the sudden load of incoming pressure. The air shifted with a density that felt engineered rather than atmospheric, and the projection brightened into a compressed arc that suggested an imminent breach rather than another probing maneuver. General Hayes watched the formation tighten with a controlled dread, recognizing the unmistakable precision of a strike pattern designed to bypass, not challenge, conventional defenses. The woman stepped closer to the interface, her shoulders settling into a posture that communicated recognition before analysis, as if her body remembered the tactic before her mind articulated it. A low-frequency alert erupted across the perimeter sensors, cascading through the tactical feed in a rapid-fire sequence that forced technicians into sharp, coordinated movements. The warnings multiplied across the upper displays, indicating structural pressure rising along the blind arc she had highlighted earlier. General Novak moved toward the secondary grid with efficient tension, his voice clipped as he issued the first directive. "Reinforce the inner lattice and shift auxiliary power to the perimeter buffer," he ordered, keeping his tone cold and controlled, despite the rising instability. Hayes countered with a stabilizing command, preventing the system from overcorrecting under its own defensive protocols. "Hold the relay balance and restrict surge feedback," he said, ensuring the grid didn't collapse from internal strain. The projection trembled as the hostile signal surged again, this time hitting the facility with a deeper pulse that forced several operators to steady their footing. She traced the tightening arc with a rapid glide of her fingers, unlocking a deeper diagnostic layer that illuminated structural weaknesses the facility's automated filters had missed. "They're applying direct pressure against the seam," she said, her voice steady despite the growing intensity. "If they find the exact fracture point, your sensors will confirm entry only after the breach is already inside." A violent flicker snapped across the tactical wall as the entire grid stuttered into momentary blindness, returning only after a half-second pulse of emergency failover. Operators tensed as the lighting dipped, then stabilized, leaving a ringing silence behind. Hayes stepped closer, sensing the timing more than the impact itself. "How close are they?" he asked quietly, though the tightening line on the projection already hinted at the answer. She placed her palm against the console, triggering an expanded structural scan that overlaid the perimeter in stark red contours, pulsing with the incoming pressure. Her voice dropped into a calm, surgical cadence. "Close enough that you're feeling the compression wave," she said. "Not the strike itself." The implications settled over the room with an icy finality that made several operators swallow hard before returning to their stations. Novak checked the relay indicators, his expression unreadable as the facility redirected power to its reinforced supports. "Stabilize the array before the next surge," he said, keeping his tone professional despite the intensity creeping through the floor. She didn't respond. Her focus narrowed as she watched the waveform constrict again, and her breath drew in with the quiet precision of someone bracing for contact. The next surge hit hard. Not a tremor impact. The floor shuddered under a directed pressure wave, pushing a metallic groan through the walls as the outer shielding flexed a fraction of an inch under the external force. The projection blinked twice, then returned with a more compressed waveform that confirmed the strike had targeted the exact seam she had warned them about. Hayes absorbed the impact with a controlled breath, reading the subtle alignment of her stance rather than the alarms echoing around the room. "You've seen this before," he said quietly, voicing what everyone else had been too cautious to articulate. She nodded once, her eyes locked onto the advancing vector. "They trained for bypass insertion," she said. "Clean entry, no alarms, fast exit. You only detect them if they want you to." Novak's tone dropped to a flat, controlled register. "And they believe they can extract you through reinforced shielding under full lockdown?" She didn't look away from the data. "They don't believe it," she said. "They designed for it." And the hostile frequency spiked harder than before, sending a sharp pulse through the facility that momentarily washed the projection in white static. Operators froze as the grid lagged again, this time for nearly a full second, before stabilizing under her updated command routing. Hayes steadied himself and glanced at her with a question held behind his eyes. Was that the breach attempt? She closed her eyes for half a second. A silent, heavy beat. Then she opened them again. "No," she said, and her voice carried the unmistakable weight of experience. "That was them pulling back on purpose." The room went still, Every operator, absorbing the implication that the enemy had measured the facility's response, tested its endurance, and withdrawn not from failure but from confidence. The waveform on the projection widened, then tightened again, forming a slow, deliberate pattern that resembled a hand closing around a fixed point. She lifted her eyes, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop with the precision in her tone. "They're close," she said softly, "closer than your system is capable of registering." Her gaze hardened as the waveform shuddered once more. "And when they come again, it won't be a test." A low structural tremor pushed through the command center as the facility rerouted power toward its hardened core, forcing several operators to tighten their stances, while the overhead lights dimmed into a colder spectrum intended for high-strain defensive cycles. The tactical wall glitched with a narrow streak of distortion before stabilizing again, revealing stress fractures across the outer shielding that indicated the system was absorbing more pressure than its infrastructure had been designed to sustain. General Hayes studied the shifting readouts with a grim awareness, sensing the enemy's proximity tightening with every recalibration. At the main console, the woman tracked the spreading stress signatures with a controlled intensity that unsettled younger technicians unaccustomed to seeing calm in the face of structural instability. The hostile waveform widened briefly before collapsing into a tighter pulse, suggesting the threat was allowing the facility to degrade under its own defensive weight rather than striking directly. She placed her hand on the interface, her posture sharpening as she reviewed the red-laced fault lines crawling through the perimeter grid. General Novak moved toward the auxiliary panel with disciplined efficiency, his voice clipped and precise as he issued the first stabilization command. "Redistribute load across secondary relays and disable non-critical subsystems," he said, ensuring the facility preserved structural balance without overextending the inner grid. Hayes followed with a parallel directive shaped for long-duration integrity. "Reinforce the internal buffer and anchor the support lattice," he instructed, prompting operators to adjust their stations with crisp, controlled movements. She triggered a deeper diagnostic tier, forcing the projection to reconfigure into a skeletal blueprint that mapped thermal stress along the conduits in pulsing red gradients. Heat signatures formed uneven clusters, indicating failure points forming beneath the outer plating. Operators exchanged tense glances as the alarms shifted into periodic pulses rather than continuous alerts, a subtle warning that the system was entering threshold-level strain. "They're not applying pressure anymore," she said, her voice cold and steady as the waveform steadied into a deep, rhythmic pulse. "They're letting your system exhaust itself until the perimeter collapses without direct force." Novak's attention sharpened as he examined the implications of her assessment, though his tone remained controlled. "They're using our redundancy architecture against us," he said flatly. "How do they know the exact limits of this facility?" She didn't look away from the projection when she answered. "Because its defensive protocols were adapted from an off-record directive I once served under," she said, delivering the admission with surgical calm. "And that directive did not allow for structural ambiguity." The operators stiffened at the implication, recognizing the depth of classification behind her disclosure. Hayes stepped closer, voice low and measured. "Name the directive," he said, cutting through the tension with quiet authority. She hesitated for a single, compressed beat before responding. "A unit designed to operate with no attribution, no continuity, and no visible chain of command," she said. "Its infrastructure was built to function in shadows even when the world believed it didn't exist." Before her words could settle, the projection spasmed with a jagged pulse that rolled across the tactical wall, plunging the command center into semi-darkness as the power grid buckled under transient overload. The facility hummed with strained vibration for several seconds while secondary arrays attempted to compensate, and operators stood rigidly still until the lighting recovered. When the projection returned, the waveform had shifted its structure tighter, its pattern more deliberate, its intention unmistakably direct. A narrow line of coded pulses appeared beneath the main frequency, blinking with measured consistency that resembled an internal authentication sequence rather than a hostile broadcast. Her breath stilled, not in fear recognition. She accessed the isolated channel with a sequence the system accepted immediately, triggering a translation field that resolved the pulses into a cluster of symbols restricted to deep classification communications. The room held its breath as the symbols clarified into a sequence she had not seen in years yet, recognized instantly. Hayes stepped closer, voice low enough that only she could hear. What does it say? It's not a message, she said quietly, never lifting her eyes from the projection. It's a verification key. Novak's tone hardened, though he maintained composure. Verification for what purpose? He asked, studying the tightening patterns with narrowed focus. The coded sequence pulsed once, then steadied into its final formation, an identification signature used only by operatives inside the directive she had belonged to. She let the silence hold for a long moment before finally lifting her gaze, her expression carved into a calm that chilled the room more effectively than any alarm. They're signaling internal recognition, she said. Hayes's posture tightened. Meaning? Her answer carried no hesitation. Meaning they are not approaching the perimeter, she said, her voice low and exact. They've already crossed it. A deep structural pulse moved through the command center as the hostile frequency folded inward, shifting from perimeter pressure into an internal resonance that crawled through the support frames like an engineered vibration rather than ambient interference. The tactical wall flickered in tight, controlled bursts, not from overload, but from signal bleeds slipping past the outer sensors, in a pattern that suggested deliberate infiltration rather than system failure. Operators stiffened at their stations, sensing the moment the threat stopped pushing against the facility and began shaping the environment from inside it. The woman leaned into the interface, her expression steady as she traced the synchronized outages, cascading across the grid in measured intervals that matched a pattern known only to units trained under deep classification directives. They're taking your internal detection offline in sequence, she said, her voice flat, precise, and void of panic. This is controlled shaping, not brute force breach. Ho! General Hayes studied the narrowing data streams with grim concentration, recognizing the difference between organic failure and intentional redirection. They're migrating along an internal vector, he said quietly, observing the pulses clustering toward a single structural path. Where does that trail lead? She activated a locked engineering display, normally requiring dual authorization, but the system recognized her embedded key and opened instantly, revealing deep structure schematics, lined with red lace stress points. The highlighted route traced downward into a reinforced access shaft positioned beneath the main floor. That junction governs structural authority channels, she said. If they isolate it, they'll sever my location from the rest of the facility. General Novak stepped closer, posture rigid, voice controlled and steady, revealing none of the discomfort tightening behind his eyes. Initiate a full-spectrum diagnostic on that corridor, he said, staying within protocol, even as the situation pushed past conventional procedures. She shook her head once, her tone sharpening without raising volume. Diagnostics won't answer. They've hijacked the feedback cycle. You're watching reflected noise, not data. A technician swallowed hard as the interface revealed the corrupted feed, static woven with narrow pulses aligned into a pattern no one could interpret except her. Hayes didn't hesitate when he issued the next command, directing it at her without looking away from the display. You have full control of the internal grid, he said. This facility defers to your assessment until further notice. How? Novak didn't outwardly flinch, but a subtle tightening across his jaw betrayed the weight of the decision. General, he said calmly, keeping discipline over doubt, we are bypassing standard chain of command. Hayes answered without looking at him. We are adapting to the threat we have. The woman began rerouting internal command pathways with rapid, efficient movements that exposed layers of the grid none of the operators knew existed. Panels unlocked under her sequences, stabilizing in seconds after resisting multiple attempts from the rest of the staff. They're bypassing your physical corridors, she said, not with movement through resonance. They're using your internal lattice as a displacement channel. A low vibration swept across the ceiling, subtle yet unmistakably directional, as if something pressed against the upper lattice from a position that sensors could not register. The lighting flickered once, then steadied under emergency reroute. Hayes placed a hand on the console, eyes narrowing at the hostile waveform tightening into a conical vector aimed directly at the upper structural grid. They've committed to a direction, he said. How long before contact? She triggered a dormant subsystem buried beneath emergency protocols, forcing the tactical projection into high-resolution deep structure mode. The access shaft below vibrated with decoy pressure, but the true displacement pulse appeared above them sharp, focused, and moving faster than any external approach could account for. Minutes, she said evenly. But the shaft is a distraction. They're building a harmonic corridor through the upper lattice. Novak glanced upward with controlled tension, though nothing disturbed the ceiling. Meaning their point of entry is above our detection field. She nodded once. They'll drop through the reinforced canopy before your sensors record the displacement. A resonance pulse moved overhead, high, sharp, cutting through the air like a wire pulled taut across the room. Several operators instinctively looked up, though discipline kept them silent. Hayes turned to her, tone low and urgent. Countermeasure. We don't block the corridor, she said. We collapse it before it stabilizes. Her fingers moved in a tight, precise sequence, initiating a controlled overload designed to destabilize the harmonic channel by pushing a counter-resonance back through the lattice. The system hesitated for half a second, then accepted the command, and the tactical wall displayed a growing counter-pattern aligning against the hostile waveform. Novak stepped forward, his voice controlled but edged with technical concern. A collapse pulse will strain the core supports, he warned. Triggering it prematurely risks structural compromise. She didn't turn toward him. Her voice remained level and exact. If I wait, they reach the canopy in 90 seconds. Another resonance pulse vibrated through the ceiling, stronger, closer, unmistakably directional. Hayes gave a single nod. Execute it. She steadied both hands on the console. A silent beat held the entire room motionless. Even the hum of the equipment seemed to draw a breath. They're here, she said quietly, and they're moving faster than your system can calculate. She executed the collapse sequence with a decisive downward command, and the facility responded instantly as a concentrated counter-resonance surged through the upper lattice, detonating across the harmonic corridor before it could stabilize into a viable insertion path. The ceiling shuddered under the impact, releasing a sharp metallic vibration that rattled the vents and triggered a cascade of momentary distortions across every active monitor. Operators braced without hesitation, adjusting their footing as secondary panels dropped into isolated mode to prevent the overload from spreading deeper into the command infrastructure. The tactical wall exploded into static before settling into a fractured display that revealed the hostile signal splitting into multiple narrow shards, each drifting through the internal map like reconnaissance probes searching for structural weaknesses. General Hayes stepped forward with a calm sharpness, reading the compression patterns along the upper grid. The corridor collapsed, he said slowly, confirming the narrowing resonance lines. But the signal didn't break. Is it? It redistributed, she replied, her voice flat and precise, as she tracked the scattered fragments reorienting themselves across the interface. A subtle vibration rolled through the floor, controlled, directional, and unmistakably internal, like a signal brushing through the facility's structural frame rather than pressing against its exterior. Operators exchanged restrained glances, maintaining discipline even as tension tightened across their shoulders. Internal sensors began failing in a patterned sequence, each shutting down in measured intervals that suggested forced override rather than mechanical burnout. Novak moved to the auxiliary panel, his posture straight and voice controlled, revealing no more emotion than the situation demanded. Identify the cause of the patterned outages, he said, scanning the shifting pulses with a trained eye. She studied the fractures with quick, calculated precision before answering. They're mapping, she said, locating potential entry points through resonance rather than movement. Hayes shifted closer, his expression steady as he watched 3 distinct pulses drift into alignment. Mapping for what? He asked, though the growing symmetry suggested the answer. She didn't hesitate. Insertion vectors. Oh, the projection pulsed once, revealing the shards aligning into 3 narrow routes, one along the upper lattice, one through the north conduit, and one moving toward the command shaft. Novak's jaw tightened, though his tone remained even. They're inside the structural layers, he said. Explain how that's possible. Her fingers moved across the interface, forcing the system into a deeper resolution mode that revealed micro-vibrations rippling through the facility's internal framework. They're using electromagnetic displacement, she said. They're not inside the walls. They're inside the resonance. The room went colder. A brief crackle emitted from the far support beam, not from a speaker, but from the metal itself, like pressure releasing in a sealed compartment. The sound was faint, but sharp enough to freeze several operators mid-motion. Hayes turned his head just slightly, acknowledging the sound without diverting control. Novak responded with a small, precise shift of posture alert, but contained. "What was that?" he asked quietly, keeping discipline over instinct. "A presence," she said. "The first one." The fractured signal on the tactical wall brightened into 3 synchronized nodes, each pulsing with slow, deliberate rhythm, as if observing the command center through the grid itself. Operators held their breath, their focus locked on the cold, expanding symmetry forming across the map. Hayes maintained his place at the center of the room, anchoring the chain of command through posture rather than volume. Novak stepped toward the main display, analyzing the pulses with increasing clarity. "This is coordinated," he said, his voice steady despite the tightening in his jaw. "Structured, intentional." Her silence held for a long, heavy beat. Then she nodded once. "I've seen this configuration." Hayes turned sharply. "From where?" "Directive-level infiltration drills," she said. "Triangulated entry. 3 vectors converge to generate a displacement window." Another tremor vibrated through the air. Not the floor tightening the atmosphere inside the room, as if the facility itself were being compressed. A thin line of dust drifted from the highest support beams before settling silently across the equipment. Hayes moved 1 step forward, projecting stability through presence alone. "Hold your stations," he instructed the operators. "Stay on the grid and maintain discipline." The tactical display pulsed again 3 points of red, aligning with slow, mathematical precision. Novak's voice dropped to a low, controlled register. "What happens when those vectors meet?" She didn't look at him when she answered. Her eyes stayed on the convergence pattern tightening on the projection. "When they converge," she said quietly, "they stop measuring the structure." A final synchronized pulse hit the grid sharp, heavy, deliberate, and they start entering. A silent beat consumed the room. Nothing moved. The convergence pattern pulsed once more. Closer, colder, unavoidable. "They're aligning on this position," she whispered. "And once alignment completes, this floor becomes the primary target vector. M." The convergence tightened into a hard geometric node on the tactical wall, compressing 3 synchronized vectors into a single pulse that vibrated through the facility's internal lattice with a sharp, metallic resonance. The lights dimmed by a measurable fraction as the structural grid absorbed the impact, and several operators shifted their footing instinctively while secondary systems flickered into stress regulation mode. The fractured signal sharpened into a breach signature thin at first, then expanding with steady precision like an engineered cut forming through reinforced architecture. The first alarm detonated across the room with a high, piercing tone that marked a rapid deviation in the upper lattice's coherence levels. Hayes stepped deeper into the command center without hesitation, anchoring the room by sheer presence as he positioned himself near the projection. "Hold your stations," he said, voice steady and unyielding. "Maintain data flow and keep all channels open." A second pulse hit sharper, denser, forcing several panels to isolate automatically as the grid rerouted load to avoid structural overheat. Novak moved to the central console with clipped precision, studying the breach signature forming along the ceiling's resonance field. "Directional pressure confirmed," he said, scanning the oscillation spikes. "They're seconds from forming a displacement window." She worked without looking up, her voice cold and measured. "They're not forming the window," she said. "They're forcing it." The tactical display shifted into a rotating triangular frame, 3 arcs tightening around a single coordinate directly above the command floor. Hayes recognized the geometry even before the system labeled it. "Insertion pattern," he said. "How long?" She activated a buried protocol level, unlocking deep spectrum diagnostics designed for non-attribution operations. The grid responded instantly, revealing microsecond fluctuations that tightened with alarming consistency. 40 to 60 seconds, she said. "Once the aperture stabilizes, entry occurs immediately." Novak's tone hardened. "We need a countermeasure now." She didn't answer yet. Instead, she drove a diagnostic through the structural channels, isolating harmonic fault lines while searching for a manipulable vector that wouldn't compromise the entire facility. A fine drift of dust shed from the upper supports as another pulse struck, more focused than before, sending a vibration through the ceiling panels that caused several operators to tense despite their discipline. Hayes stepped closer. "Options?" She paused one tight, waited second, then finally answered. "There is a method," she said, "but it was never intended for infrastructure this large." Novak's eyes barely shifted. "State it." Her tone didn't waver. "A directive. Grade inversion pulse." Operators froze, unfamiliar with the term but aware of its gravity. Hayes, however, understood enough to feel the pressure behind it. That collapses the geometry by reversing its harmonic anchor, he said. It could rupture the lattice. She nodded once. If the pulse is too strong, we overload the core supports. If it's too weak, the corridor restabilizes. And if your calibration is perfect? Hayes pressed. It seals the aperture, she said, and forces them to reposition. Novak gave a single, controlled nod. Execute it. But she didn't move. Instead, she finally lifted her eyes from the console, meeting his gaze with a cold steadiness that cut through the noise. Triggering the inversion pulse exposes my signature, she said. Not the system's, mine. A stillness dropped over the room, heavy, immediate, absolute. Hayes broke the silence first, voice low. Explain. If my signature hits the field, she said, they identify me as the primary vector. A deeper resonance rolled overhead, tight, focused, indicating the geometry had reached 90% stability. The triangular frame brightened with stark red light, its internal lines stiffening as coherence locked into microsecond range. Novak's voice remained controlled. Then calibrate it. We have no alternative. For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes, an old hesitation, brief but cutting gone before anyone could name it. Then she pressed her hand to the console and activated the directive protocol. The system hesitated for half a heartbeat before unlocking layers buried beneath clearance levels none of the operators had ever seen. Energy surged through the lower conduits, coiling upward into a narrow compression field that spiraled across the tactical display with cold, mathematical precision. The facility buckled as the pulse built, forcing operators to grip their stations as emergency dimming engaged across every lighting strip. Then the inversion detonated. The triangular geometry ripped apart in a burst of white static, its coherence shattering on contact with the counterfield as the facility's lattice absorbed the backlash. Several monitors blanked momentarily before reinitializing with force stability overlays. Hayes steadied himself with one hand, scanning the projection as the fractured signal disintegrated into incoherent fragments. "Status?" he demanded. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were locked on a single new pulse emerging at the far edge of the grid, small, sharp, impossibly focused, and moving toward her signature trace. Her expression tightened cold, controlled, but unmistakably aware. "They detected me," she said quietly, "and now they're adjusting their approach." And the pulse sharpened into a narrow beam of concentrated telemetry, aligning with her inversion signature at sub-millisecond precision as it cut across the tactical display with unnerving accuracy. The system translated the lock sequence immediately, marking it as operator-specific rather than structural, and several operators straightened unconsciously as the reality settled over the room like a tightening vice. The vector ignored every automated defense the facility attempted to deploy, tracking directly along the signature imprint woven into her earlier inversion pulse. Hayes stepped toward the projection, eyes narrowing as he watched the beam refine itself into a stable acquisition line that behaved like a targeting algorithm rather than a breach tool. "That's a direct lock," he said quietly, his tone steady enough to anchor the room despite the weight behind his words. "They're not tracking the facility anymore." She didn't look away from the display, her voice flat and stripped of anything resembling hesitation. "They're tracking me," she said. "Phase alignment confirms a full operator-level acquisition." Novak examined the telemetry with rigid focus, his posture controlled but the tension behind his discipline unmistakable. "That sequence isn't used against standard personnel," he said, maintaining a cold, analytical cadence. "It requires pre-existing data classification above anything conventional." She finally turned her head slightly, offering him a single clipped acknowledgement. "Correct." A thin vibration moved through the floor, precise, directional, recorded instantly by the structural accelerometers as a resonant spike moving toward her position. The system alarms recalibrated, shifting from structural threat to individual threat classification as the hostile vector synchronized with her biometric trace. Hayes absorbed the shift with controlled clarity, his tone firm but level. "System reclassifies the intrusion as operator targeted engagement," he announced, meaning the vector is committed. The tactical wall brightened as the lock pattern deepened into a hardened acquisition frame, its rhythm matching her inversion pulse with mechanical precision. Operators maintained their discipline, their movements measured, their breathing steady. though the tightening air pressure revealed the escalating strain spreading across the room. The facility automatically shifted into emergency defensive posture blast shutters, sealing along upper walkways, magnetic clamps engaging across the reinforced doorframes, and internal firebrake partitions sliding into position with muted metallic impacts. Novak stepped closer, studying the shift with a new, quiet intensity that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. "This lock behavior is only documented in black-tier case files," he said. "Operator-level engagements tied to units without formal designation." She didn't deny it. She only watched the tightening beam with an unreadable calm. "Then, you understand the nature of what's responding." Hayes turned slightly, reading the gravity behind her tone. "This isn't an assault on the facility," he said. "It's an attempt to extract or neutralize you." "That's the intent," she replied. "The structure is incidental." Another vibration rippled overhead, sharper than the last, causing a brief flicker in the emergency spectrum lighting as the beam pulsed again, short, surgical, deliberate, as if testing the boundary between resonance and contact. The tactical display synchronized instantly, marking the event as pre-contact compression, a stage rarely recorded because most systems failed before reaching that threshold. Novak examined the waveform with hard focus. "What's their next step?" he asked, though the data was beginning to form a pattern he already recognized. She answered without turning. "They'll initiate physical integrity testing. Not on the walls. On me." End quote. A dead, heavy silence dropped over the room, cutting through the hum of the servers and the distant grind of the lockdown mechanisms. No one spoke. No one shifted. Even the air felt momentarily suspended, waiting for the next phase. Hayes broke the stillness with quiet authority, his voice resonant enough to stabilize the operator's breathing without raising its volume. "We hold formation," he said. "Maintain full operational clarity and keep all defensive subsystems online. No deviation." The hostile lock tightened again, adjusting its alignment by a fraction of a degree so precise the system could only describe it as identity-target convergence. Operators exchanged brief, disciplined glances, each understanding the significance without needing explanation. Novak finally spoke again, his voice lower now, but colder. "You were part of something that wasn't marked in any chain of command," he said. "Something designed to exist without records." She didn't blink when she answered. "That's why they can find me." Hayes inhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling through his stance. "And why the facility couldn't stop the lock." The vector pulsed, once short, deep, unmistakably close, sending a microshock through the reinforced ceiling that made the overhead panels quiver like something pressing from the wrong side of reality. The tactical display interpreted the spike instantly, marking it as first-stage contact initialization. Her posture adjusted calm, exact, sharpened by memory rather than fear. "They're crossing the threshold," she said quietly, "and the first contact will target me directly." Another pulse closer, deeper, focused. Hayes steadied himself. Operators tightened their stance. Novak watched the beam shift into near-contact frequency. Then the room fell into a silence heavy enough to bend the air. "It's starting," she whispered, "and they're coming through the lock. And, The ceiling vibrated with tight, low-frequency pressure as the targeting vector reached contact threshold, bending the reinforced panels with a precision that suggested engineered intent rather than environmental strain. Several operators adjusted their footing automatically, while accelerometers spiked across the monitors, confirming a localized force approaching the command floor with microsecond consistency. A narrow band of refracted light appeared above the room, thin, sharp, clinically defined like a compressed field line drilling through structural density. She stepped forward before anyone else reacted, placing herself directly beneath the descending vector, her movement synchronized with the beam's adjustments as if anticipating its calibration shifts. Hayes shifted as though to intercept, but she stopped him with a small, exact gesture that carried more authority than rank could provide. "Maintain position behind the grid," she said quietly, her tone flat enough to override instinct without raising her voice. The fracture widened by a measurable margin, releasing a controlled shockwave that rippled across the room, forcing several secondary panels to compensate with rapid stabilization pulses. Novak analyzed the aperture with rigid precision, his expression remaining professional even as recognition tightened his posture. "This configuration matches extraction-level geometry," he said, voice steady and stripped of emotion. "It's locking to an operator, not a location." She didn't acknowledge him, focusing instead on the center of the forming field, where the air refracted under coil pressure, generating a distortion with a faint outline resembling a density shift rather than a visible shape. Hayes moved closer, not to replace her position, but to reinforce the command stance behind her, his presence grounding the operators who maintained control despite the escalating strain. "You're not isolated on this floor," he said quietly, giving support without attempting to counter her lead. The distortion pressed downward again, stronger, more coherent, engaging the structural frame in a way that suggested the presence on the other side was aligning directly with her signal rather than the facility's architecture. Novak absorbed the pattern, voice dropping into a controlled, analytical cadence. "You weren't attached to a black tier unit," he said. "You were its central operating signature." She didn't deny it. Her silence was confirmation. The aperture expanded another 2 centimeters, triggering an automated reinforcement cycle as the system attempted to redirect load away from the command floor. A thin vibration rolled through the air itself, sharp, directed, systematic, forcing the reinforced ceiling plates to shift by fractions as the vector narrowed onto her with unwavering precision. She adjusted her stance, aligning with the beam in a way that indicated practiced familiarity rather than instinct. The system flagged contact proximity across all displays, marking her as primary vector with a crimson perimeter indicator that pulsed at the same rate as the descending field. Operators held position, disciplined enough to mask the pressure tightening behind their controlled breathing. Hayes watched the aperture stabilize, understanding the intent as the distorted outline sharpened into a coherent density shift aimed solely at her. "They're not breaching the structure," he said. "They're breaching to reach you." Her response carried no hesitation. No contact occurs without identifying its target. A microsecond crack of static flickered across the air, silent but violent, signaling first-stage penetration, a phase most facilities never survived long enough to document. The presence pushed through by another fractional increment, its outline no longer abstract but defined enough to suggest awareness, calibration, and purpose. Novak took a half-step back, not in fear, but because the final piece of his analysis locked into place. "You were never meant to be visible," he said, voice low and controlled. A brief, weighted beat passed. Heavy, cold, absolute. The aperture tightened, and the presence began crossing the threshold directly toward her.